I've just played you the opening of the second movement of Haydn's D major sonata on a Broadwood piano. My lecture recital today investigates the comparison of a Viennese and an English forte piano, demonstrated by Haydn's London piano sonatas. I am motivated by a desire to understand the important characteristics of Viennese and English instruments. We are talking about quite different instruments, and that is the reason behind my research, where Haydn is the continuous part and the pianos are the variable parts. To use this to consider my other issues, how the piano as an instrument developed and how this development affected keyboard technique, as we say how to speak on the Viennese and how to sing on the English pianos, and how these differences influenced Haydn when writing for the instrument. To investigate this, first I'm going to start with the main characteristics of these instruments and the compositional tools used by English composers and later adopted by Haydn, demonstrated by his London piano sonatas. While in modern times standardization has, to a greater extent, affected the craft of piano building, instruments were still very personal works of art in the 18th century. Consequently, pianos were different from town to town, from builder to builder, and even within a single builder's output. The relative novelty of the instrument and the different demands of customers created an aesthetic of constant experimentation with all the parameters of the design, so that instruments were substantially different within one builder's output, as you can see on these two Broadwood pianos, roughly from the same time. Although within a certain era craftsmen did influence each other, the distance between cities as far apart as London and Vienna resulted in the establishing of two distinctive schools of piano building. Thus we have come to recognize two main types of early or forte pianos, the English and the Viennese. These schools were not limited to two cities, because English pianos were also built in France and Scandinavia, just as Viennese pianos were also made in Germany. For practical reasons, I'm going to narrow my demonstration on the two most well-known types, namely John Broadwood's and Anton Walter's instruments. As you can see, the English instruments were more robustly constructed compared to the fine Viennese instruments of the era. And I'm sure you would ask, how did they become so different? The external features of the instruments clearly resemble to the type of harpsichords used in the different areas. By the 70s-60s, the piano was known in many, if not most, major European cities. Were all late 18th century keyboard players in favor of the new instrument? The answer to this question is quite clearly no. Whilst pianos were becoming increasingly available all over Europe, as the century progressed, the older harpsichord and clavichord remained common in performance until at least the 1780s. Prominent builders of the English school were Americus Bakers, Johann Zumpe, John Broadwood, Muzio Clementi, and builders of the Viennese instruments included Andreas Stein, Anton Walter, Konrad Graf, Nanette Streicher, and many others. So, after a slow start, the progression of the piano was much quicker after the middle of the 18th century. The piano was introduced to France and England in the 1750s from Germany. In the decade that followed, its profile was enhanced by its use in public performances all over Europe and by the publication of music which specifically mentions the instrument. But what sort of pianos were used for these public performances? Nothing is known about the instrument used for the first Viennese public performance, as makers in Italy and southern Germany were producing both grand and square pianos. Either could have been used on this and other occasions. The situation was different in England, however. By the late 1760s, Zumpe made a good number of square pianos, to judge from the number that still survive, as well as references for these instruments in contemporary accounts. On the left, you can see an early example for a square piano by Zumpe. In contrast, Americus Bacchus, the first maker of English grands, probably did not begin making his pianos much before 1770. The earliest performances on the piano in England were therefore on squares, while grands were presumably used with increasing frequency from around 1770. And on the right, you can see the earliest surviving English grand piano, currently at the University of Edinburgh's collection. Explicit differences between the English and Viennese models are noted in many sources from the 18th and early 19th century. One of the most important of these descriptions is found in Johann Nepomuk Hammel's Ausführliche theoretische praktische Anweisung from 1828. Differences were discussed both in terms of piano manufacturing and of performing, as in Frederick Kalkbrenner's method. Kalkbrenner, who lived in London from 1814 to 1823, prescribed in his treatise English works for study. In 1853, the famous pedagogue Friedrich Wieck, Schumann's teacher, still mentioned these differences, which, as it was noted around the same time, had led to a new way of composing for the instrument as well. To understand the basic characteristics, first we should look at the different actions of these pianos. On this video you can see the action of a 1799 Broadwood piano, the one Haydn must have made during his visits. As may you have noticed, the hammer of the English action is attached to a rail and points away from the player. Therefore, a jack is needed to push up the rear of the hammer, close to the hinge. The jack escapes under a wooden block on which the hammer shank is glued. The hammer is then caught by a check. In the Viennese action, the hammer points towards the player. The hammer is fixed in a fork or capsule on the rear end of the key, which functions as a hinge when the rear end of the hammer shank, pushed up through the movement of the key, is caught by the escapement. The hammer butt is released when the escapement moves backwards. To judge from contemporary accounts, the difference between these actions resulted in the English pianos having a heavier feel to the touch and a fuller, more powerful tone. Worth to know that although the action of most English pianos were heavier than the Viennese pianos between 1790 to 1835, but it became lighter from 1836 to 1850. Nevertheless, the greater depth of the key dip and wider octave compass of the English pianos were more significant, which may affected the timing, the note to be played, and of course the choice of articulation. But the real difference is in the damping and clarity, not in the structure. Let's have a look at the different damping systems. English dampers consist of light wooden clamps holding together strips of cloth, the edges of which rest on the strings. In the Viennese bass, comparatively heavy wooden blocks glued to leather-covered wedges fall between the strings. In the treble, a flat felt pad dampens the 2 or 3 strings of each unison. The English dampers are much less efficient than the Viennese. This results in a substantial aftering, which lends the instruments a resonating quality. This aftering lasts longer in the bass than in the treble. As a result, the reverberation in the bass can last several seconds after a fortissimo staccato chord. English builders could easily have adopted a more effective system, for instance one based on the Viennese. From the fact that they had onto the system with a quality of damping, we must conclude that this particular sound effect was based on a different musical aesthetics. But how these dampers were operated? On both the early English and Viennese pianos, the dampers were lifted by hand stops. Later in England, the hand stop was replaced by a pedal. In Vienna, it was replaced by a knee lever. On surviving English pianos, it can be seen that the top dampers were blocked from falling. On the other hand, as Kalkbrenner noted, that to avoid confusion, Viennese pianos had dampers all the way up to the top note. The result was, as he described, a great dryness. He solved the problem during a concert by placing a piece of cork under the damper rail of the top octaves, thus physically altering the piano according to his taste. He also wrote about the use of damper or forte pedal in London. Dušek, Johnfield, and Kramer, the leaders of that school, of which Clementi is the founder, makes use of the forte pedal as long as the harmony does not change. Dušek was especially remarkable for that, because he kept the dampers almost continuously raised when he played in public. We may therefore assume that the pedal became a regular, though initially modestly used element of the playing style as soon as it was built onto the piano. Compared to the bass, the English treble was particularly powerful. Although John Broadwood's invention of the divided bridge in the early 1790s had more nearly equalized the tone, especially in the middle range of the instrument, still the bass notes were very much inferior to the treble. In a letter of 1803 to his business partner Collard, Clementi described the tonal aesthetic of the English school. The treble of the English forte piano is strong and full, and in fine balance with the bass. In addition, the tone is not brilliant, sharp or silver, but rather muffled and sometimes described as dull. By comparison, many Viennese pianos were built with only one bridge until well into the 19th century. This created a much admired difference in tone between the different registers of the instrument, but also tipped the balance between the two registers in favor of the bass. Karl Czerny commented on Johann Baptist Kramer's and Jan Ladislav Dušek's playing in 1839. Beautiful cantabile, the avoiding of all coarse effects, an astonishing equality in the runs and passages, as a compensation for the degree of volubility which is less thought of in their works. The examination of the playing style of Clementi, Kramer, and Dušek shows that producing a singing tone was essential in performance in London at the time. The English keyboard instrument was more capable of producing a cantabile sound. This was the way to sing on the English piano. On the other hand, many 18th century German and Viennese treatises stressed the need for clarity, or Deutlichkeit, as one of the most important aspects of good delivery. To achieve this clear, highly articulated delivery that was the ideal of the German and Viennese piano and its composers, the dampers had to cut off the sound immediately upon falling back on the strings. Aftering was considered unpleasant. This was the way to speak on the Viennese instruments. As I've mentioned before, articulation does not play the same role in the style of the English composers as it does in the Viennese school. The inefficient damping and full tone led to the adoption of legato as a basic touch, already before 1800. The first important treatise in which actual legato was described as a basic touch came out in England. The Introduction to the Art of Playing on the Pianoforte in 1801 by Muzio Clementi. He says, "When the composer leaves the legato and staccato to the performer's taste, the best rule is to adhere chiefly to the legato, reserving the staccato to give spirit occasionally to certain passages, and to set off the higher beauties of the legato. In Vienna and Germany, the basic touch was non-legato until well after the 1800s. In Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach's The Art of Playing the Keyboard from 1753 and Daniel Gottlob Türk's The School of Clavier Playing from 1789, the basic touch was still non-legato, just as Hummel advocated it as the basic touch in 1828. The most important foreign composer to visit London and become intimately familiar with the English piano was Joseph Haydn. His two visits to London are the best documented parts of his life, and his compositions from this period written for the English piano are the most admired and most often performed from his entire output for keyboard. They include 3 solo sonatas and 4 sets of 3 trios, as well as the accompaniments to the English canzonettas. It was Johann Peter Salomon who brought Haydn to London, and we can see them both on these portraits. Haydn seems intentionally to have adopted the English style. He had studied Clementi's works before he went to England. As Christopher Hogwood mentions in his book, in 1783 Haydn thanked Artaria for sending him a collection of Clementi sonatas, describing them as very beautiful. Haydn also told Johann Peter Salomon upon his arrival in England that there would be ample time for him to compose his first symphonies, after he had had an opportunity of studying the taste of the English. It will be shown that this attitude also applied to his piano works. The English musical environment and style influenced Haydn's piano works in fullness of sound, range of expression, and increase in technical difficulties. This is evident in his use of the pedal, octave melodies, high chords in the treble, counter-resonance notation, runs in thirds and octaves, as well as in density in piano scoring. None of these style features had been a prominent part of his keyboard language previous to the London visits. When he was in London, he used English pianos to his performances. During his first visit, he borrowed Duschek's Broadwood piano. Moreover, he stayed at Great Pulteney Street, just a few meters away from the Broadwood piano factory. Broadwood's instruments were esteemed by many leading pianists of the late 18th and early 19th century. Haydn visited the factory in 1794. The aftering of the English piano made it necessary for the English composers to notate short notes with extra care in order to get the sharp cutoff that they wanted. We might call this counter-resonance notation. Haydn was very much aware of this peculiarity of the English piano, the much less immediate damping and aftering as the C major sonata shows. The opening of the sonata in C major is an example of Haydn trying to achieve a Viennese sound on an English piano. The fermata in the 6th bar is a great opportunity to stop as long as the sound dies away. Only with the unexpected grand chords does he open the rich resources of the instrument. The muffled tone of the English piano led to a kind of writing in which the composers tried to relieve the inherent dullness of the treble. By writing in octaves, melodies become more brilliant. When octave melodies are slurred, pedal is implied. Haydn's sonata in D major has always been regarded as a companion of the 2 great sonatas for Therese Jansen. However, since it was written for amateur rather than professional circles, It is an excellent example of easy and popular songfulness that characterize the works of, for instance, Dussek. The long melodies are often written in octaves and sing out over an easy flowing accompaniment. This increases cantabile character considerably, especially when the bass figuration allows the performer to use the damper pedal, often throughout the whole measure. Here is an example from the first movement. I've already mentioned that English composers and performers developed legato touch to a higher level. A good tool was the overholding technique, where the broken chords of the accompaniment part in the left hand could be played by overholding the bass note. By doing so, the accompaniment creates sufficient resonance to support the melody without using the pedal. Here is an example from the D major sonata's first movement. Haydn also uses his first and only pedal markings in the C major sonata. There has been some discussion on the meaning of open pedal. Only from a historical aspect we can tell that Haydn meant the damper pedal and that he meant the dampers to be raised. Clementi explained at the beginning of the printed score of his Opus 40 in 1802. Pedal is for pressing down the open pedal and star for letting it go again. But this is also a good example to the use of the unicorda pedal, which was totally different than the Viennese, because you can literally make una and due corde by pushing down a small wedge on the right side of the keyboard. These new sound capabilities and sound quality led to a new grand style and virtuosity. In his Opus 2 sonatas, Clementi set a new standard of virtuosity with techniques like runs in thirds, sixths, and octaves, arpeggio and scale passages, leaps and big chords, all combined with the ample use of the keyboard extremes resulting from the desire for greater brilliance in the treble and greater sonority in the bass. These sonatas exerted an enormous influence on later generations of pianists. Their virtuosity became a key part of the new English piano style. Mozart criticized Clementi's empty virtuosity in a letter after their famous contest before the emperor in Vienna in 1781. He wrote that Clementi's works contained no remarkable or striking passages except those in sixths and octaves, and what he really does well are his passages in thirds. Mozart cannot be blamed for his dislike of his empty virtuosity, as Clementi himself no longer liked it 3 decades later. The D major sonata shows in its many low bass sonorities how Haydn was affected by the new coloristic possibilities of the English piano. The multitude of low basses, often in octaves or murky basses, throughout the London works, unequaled with his pre-London output, leaves no doubt about the taste of the English dilettantes and virtuosos for grandness, and Haydn's willingness to supply them with pieces in that style. These two parts also show good examples for the Clementi thirds. The thicker tone, long aftering, heavier touch, and the deeper key dip of the English piano made it more resistant to larger chords, in which the pianist had to make more use of the weight of the arm rather than finger play, as in Vienna. This gave rise to a full, sometimes chordal style. Before that, large chords were usually in the slow introduction, like in Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata. The opening of many sonatas by Clementi, Kramer and Dussek, as of many piano concertos, is grand, large, often arpeggiated chords, sometimes spanning a range of 3 to 4 octaves. The opening of Dussek's The Suffering of the Queen of France is a fine example of orchestral scoring. In general, we can say that works of the English piano composers have a far more sonorous quality than those of the Viennese. Haydn used the same chordal effect in his E-flat major sonata. The sonata in E-flat major is Haydn's grandest piano solo work, grander even than the previous chords which opened the piece. A scale in thirds right after the opening is only one component of its English virtuosity. Other English style elements include counter-resonance notation and a fast descending scale covering more than 3.5 octaves. This sonata was published only 3 years later, giving an opportunity for Therese Jansen, the dedicatee, to perform it during her concerts. These characteristic features of English pianos led not only to the emergence of a distinct English classical style and the evolvement of keyboard technique, but also influenced Haydn to adopt an English style of composing for the keyboard. Nearly all his English works show elements of the native piano that do not appear in his pre-London works. The extent to which he committed himself to the English idiom is so great that one may state that these works, when ideally performed, will not be as successful on a Viennese piano as on an English one.